The term systemic game is something that seems to be getting thrown around more and more as time goes on. People don't like them anymore, apparently they do again, and even Zelda's getting in on the action. Again. And, well, I've got a bit of a confession to make about these kinds of games. For all the talk of games that are obstinately about systems, for the longest time I wasn't really sure what, exactly, made a game systemic. This was a deep and well-kept personal shame for ages, until I figured out that no one else really knows either. One Google for systemic games doesn't turn up any results for things you can actually play, but a bunch of designers and writers, as well as a weird YouTube guy, trying to explain to you how a systemic game gets made. It's a really hard topic to concisely explain, because system is such an abstract, terrible term. It basically just means a bunch of things working together, not to mention the fact that all games already have systems in them. And yet, systemic games like Deus Ex and MGS5 definitely have a unique vibe that makes them feel different to play. But without really being able to articulate what makes a game systemic, it's even harder to explain the strengths and weaknesses of this particular development style. So, that's what I've spent the last few weeks trying to do, to develop a theory of systemic games that's easy to understand and allows me to talk about what makes systemic games better or worse in certain areas, but crucially doesn't require me to spend 10 minutes trying to define the word system, because that sounds really boring. Enter The Legend of Zelda, which I think is a great framing device for concisely showing the differences between systemic and what I'm calling directed styles of design. Did you know that The Legend of Zelda was originally inspired by Shigeru Miyamoto's Adventures in the Woods? As a kid, he used to spend hours adventuring into caves, finding cool wildlife and generally making his own fun. So, when he pitched The Legend of Zelda, his intent was to translate his childhood fun into video game form, which makes it a little bit weird that the vast majority of Zelda games are kind of bad at doing just that. From the original Legend of Zelda, all the way up to Skyward Sword, Zelda games had a gradual but clear trajectory away from exploring an unknown wilderness armed only with your wits, and towards a series of cinematic, tightly segregated and bottlenecked theme parks. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of most Zelda games, and they excel at tight dungeon designs, brilliant audio-visual moments, and occasionally great stories, but they're not exactly games about exploration, adventure, and discovery, are they? It wasn't until Nintendo set things back to zero with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild that Miyamoto's 30-plus-year-old vision was finally realised. BOTW is all about freedom and player experimentation. It's got a truly open world where you can head to the final boss straight away, a bunch of clever problems for you to solve that rely not on figuring out arbitrary puzzle mechanics but your understanding of the way the world works, and the ruins of Hyrule are able to generate spontaneous stories, seemingly at random, by combining various rule sets together, like this perilous climb up a tower whilst under guardian fire, explosive chain reaction assassinations, and of course, self-inflicted electrical deaths. Breath of the Wild isn't the only Zelda game to have fire mechanics, weapon degradation, or terrain destruction, but what sets it apart is how these mechanics interact and coexist with the player as part of a living systemic ecosystem. Take wind for example. In Skyward Sword, wind comes from the gust bellows, and is used to do two things: spin these windmills, and blow away dust. It doesn't meaningfully interact with the world in any other way, and you can really only use this item when the game tells you to. But in Breath of the Wild, wind affects and is affected by the entire world. It blows light objects around and is blocked by dense objects, as shown in Rin Oya's shrine. Wind can also be generated by the weather system and by you with Deku Leaves or by fire, which creates an updraft capable of lifting Link into the air. And don't even get me started on the fact that every object in the game has its own mass and density, which allows for stuff like these weird balloon forts in Master Mode. My point is, all these mechanics, rather than being separated and highly controlled, all work together and interact organically to create a world that feels natural and responds in predictable, consistent ways to your actions. In a systemic game, the player is just one portion of a dynamic, reactive world that could theoretically exist all on its own. For example, each sim in the very creatively named The Sims will live a complete virtual life, get a job, have kids, and get trapped in a ladderless pool and die completely on their own. The player just gets to interact with them rather than being the star of the show. And in Sid Meier's even more creatively named Civilization, the AI civilizations will go to war, sign trade agreements and grow, even without the player's input. The key difference between systemic games and directed games such as walking sims or cinematic action blockbusters is that directed design produces games that are much more rigid in nature, in order to give the player much more specific experiences where the mechanics are kept tightly under control. This is where the real strength of systemic games lies. Rather than being funneled through a linear, restrictive experience where you have to engage with the game in a particular way, players get total freedom. If it's possible within the game's system of rules and interactions, you're basically free to do whatever you want. This cultivates a much more experimental, improvisational relationship with the game, where the narrative isn't communicated to the player by the developer, but instead the player gets to collaboratively create it for themselves. The challenges players face in systemic games can also be sourced from the ecosystem of mechanics. An orc leader that killed you might reappear at the worst possible time in Shadow of Mordor, a wildfire might break out in Far Cry 2, or weird terrain generation in a survival game might provide an interesting barrier to exploration. Whatever the cause, the player gets to feel like their experience is unique and not being forced upon them by a second party. We can see this in immersive sims like Dishonored, where you can progress through the levels by playing through them in a variety of ways, and regardless of which way you pick, you'll end up telling your own unique story. You could go full aggro and carve a bloody swath through Karnaka, you could play with the stealth systems and clever ways of incapacitating enemies non-violently to become a sneaky ghost, or you could just kill bad guys in dumb, hilarious ways. It's up to you. The game's actual objectives are just ways of pushing you into interesting situations that allow you to develop and test your systemic knowledge. These electrified gates you need to bypass in Kirin Jindosh's pad will obliterate anything they're not attuned to, so to get past them, you'll need to short them out with an object, reprogram them, or find another way around through enemy-infested territory, all of which will lead to some cool encounters. Unlockable skills also add new possibilities and complications to your storytelling that let you push the game to its limits and feel like a genius for pulling crazy stuff off. My personal favourite interaction is combining Emily's ability to summon a doppelganger and another spell that links enemies together, allowing you to safely dispatch entire groups by killing the doppelganger from safety and letting the effect get chained to everyone else because your clones technically count as killable humanoid entities. That doppelganger takedown wasn't even intended by the designers, it's just a natural extrapolation of Dishonored systems and a true emergent solution to the age-old question of what's the best way to cheese the fuck out of this game. Moments like this are only possible when the systems in the game act in a way that's, if not realistic, then consistent. In order to become a part of the complex web of systems at work in, say, Hitman, the rules of the system have to be clear. Enemies will always interact in the same way when they catch you trespassing, emetic poison always forces enemies to find somewhere to throw up, and unconscious bodies, like this lady I knocked out with a rake, will always cause civilians to go tell a guard NPC, who will then raise the alarm, and eventually get me killed. If the systems are inconsistent, like in the case of immortal essential NPCs in some of the newer Bethesda games, then the player's understanding of the game is compromised, and it's much more difficult for them to get invested in the stories the game generates, and makes creating their own emergent solutions and stories harder as well. Unfortunately, the trick to making a great systemic game is a bit more complex than just tying all the systems together in a logical, internally consistent way. The greatest strength of systemic games, namely their ability to create emergent stories and problems, can also be their greatest weakness. Sometimes a systemic game with every part working correctly can still end up making boring, frustrating, or outright broken experiences. During the development of the fantastic Noita, the developers, who previously worked on such great games as The Swapper, Crayon Physics Deluxe and Babra's U, ran into this exact issue. Noita, for those who don't know, is an early access roguelike that takes inspiration from that falling sand game everyone used to play in IT classes when they were supposed to be learning how to use Excel. There's liquids that flow around and all have different densities, explosives, a bunch of different materials all with different effects like brittle ice and conductive metal, the works. Just like in its inspiration, Noita's world is governed by a set of systemic interactions. Oil can be ignited, explosions destroy terrain, acid melts through stuff, you get the picture. With all the effects in the entire game world going off at once, not only did Noita eat up ungodly amounts of processing power, but also the systemic elements would just obliterate themselves and each level long before the player arrived, as we can see in this early prototype. So, the devs decided not to simulate the whole world at once, but to generate fresh terrain as the player explored, and cleverly unload areas the player was far away from. This means that the player gets to see and interact with all the world's emergent scenarios at their maximum chaos levels, and is forced to deal with all the literal fallout the systemic nonsense creates, rather than just wandering around in the aftermath. Being an early access game, Noita still has some other kinks to work out. Not those kind of kinks, you perv. One issue that's still in the game as of writing is with these tunneling wormy boys, who have a nasty habit of munching their way into between level shops, pissing off the Guardian shop skeleton and ending my run. Both the levels destroying themselves and the worm sabotage are natural consequences of Noita's systems interacting and are certainly novel the first time around, but they're not very much fun. And so it's a real challenge for designers of systemic games to add, take away and tweak things without restricting the player's sense of self-expression or compromising that systemic ecosystem. Derek Yu, creator of the granddaddy of systemic roguelikes Spelunky, has an interesting take on this. He says in his book, it's easy to add more and more things to a randomized game and rely on what I think of as the free value the randomization offers. But to make it more than a glorified slot machine requires putting together a collection of systems and rules that is worth understanding, behind a world that feels interconnected. Rather than simply hurling the player into a chaotic maelstrom of chance mechanical interactions, Spelunky's rules are fine-tuned to allow for the creation of specific kinds of stories. There can be funny ones, like how a single attack can piss off every shopkeeper in the universe at once. There can be satisfying ones where you set up an ambush by manipulating arrow traps to kill enemies, and there can be tense ones, like when you're navigating down the ice caves as UFOs destroy what little safe terrain exists. These stories are all generated by nothing more than Spelunky's rules in action. Arrow traps are activated by anything, the shopkeepers have a hair trigger, and UFOs move towards the Spelunker, only firing when they're directly above him. And yet, there's that little tiny touch of directorial intent in there. For example, spiders will always drop straight down, making them a natural candidate for some sneaky arrow trap action. Derek Yu's influence is very much hands-off, but it's crucial for ensuring that Spelunky remains fun and never gets frustrating. Derek Yu also goes on to explain how simply by tweaking the enemy spawn rates, individual levels can be made to feel very different from each other, contributing to a universal narrative for each run. The further you explore into the jungle, for example, the higher proportion of enemies will spawn as man-traps, which have a habit of devouring everything else, leading to really tense engagements where you've got to sacrifice less dangerous creatures to the carnivorous plants in order to slip by. A far cry from the earlier levels filled with monkeys which spawn earlier on, who are much more of a funny, often suicidal nuisance. Other systemic games can do this too. In RimWorld, raiders grow in strength proportionally to the combined material wealth of your entire colony, meaning that they're a constant threat, and even when you get lucky, that wealth won't last forever. Or in Total War games, where the inherent balance of power between factions creates predictable game states that end up giving each empire a lot of character. The High Elves will nearly always confederate under Tyrion, the Skaven always have incredibly unstable empires constantly on the verge of collapse because their economic and defensive buildings suck, and everyone likes to bully Skarsnik the Goblin because he has the weakest start in the game. These tweaks are ultimately little more than statistical changes, but each one helps to give its respective system its own unique feel. From monkeys, to worms, to wind, to whatever the hell is going on here, it's clear to see that systemic games are different. Not because they're special or contain something other games don't, but because of their difference in perspective. They embrace the emergent and simulation-y properties of the digital medium to create experiences that let the player get immersed into reactive, dynamic worlds that can tell stories with minimal amounts of direct authorship. They can be used as a springboard to let players have adventures, explore mechanics, and make their own fun by giving them the tools they need to gradually understand how to manipulate the world without ever truly putting them in the spotlight. It's easy to see why a lot of people think systemic design is the future, that all games should start taking cues from Breath of the Wild or Dishonored or Spelunky to create reactive worlds that contain almost limitless potential experiences. But I'm not convinced. Systemic games are great, and we've barely scratched the surface of what we're capable of making with this approach, but as I've hopefully shown here, systemic games do have limits, and there are things that other, more directorial styles of game design do better by using systems in different ways. Take the experience of playing highly linear narrative games like Nier Automata or Hellblade: Senua's Scarface. These games tell stories in a way that would be impossible to do in any other medium, by giving us a physical, empathetic link to the characters, tightly controlling what we can and can't do, and ensuring we see things in the right order for everything to make sense. The big emotional moments and incredible set pieces directorial games have to offer only work because players don't have the freedom to skip to the end or experience the story in a different order. These games use systems which are at best opaque and inaccessible, and at worst directly misleading, but ultimately, that doesn't make them worse, just different. Breath of the Wild might be able to recreate the childlike feeling of going on a wilderness adventure, but it will never match Ocarina of Time's ability to tell a coming-of-age story, or even Skyward Sword's surprisingly amazing boss fights. And that's okay. Whilst figuring out what systemic games are all about is pretty tricky, The most important lesson to take away is to broaden our perspective and see that systemic games are just one element in the massive gaming ecosystem, and by understanding them, we can enrich every other style of game. Just like how a systemic approach revitalised Zelda, and how a bit of hands-on fiddling turned Spelunky into an all-time classic, understanding and mixing different styles and approaches is what contributes best to our evolving understanding of the systems involved in game design. Does this mean that the Wand of Gamelon probably has a small but significant place in this system? Unfortunately, yes. Look, I mean, I don't make the rules, sometimes we just gotta deal with it, okay?
Oh boy! I'm so hungry, I could eat an Octorok!
Hello, and thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, then please consider liking it, subscribing to the channel, and telling your friends by writing down the contents of the video on a small scroll, rolling it up, attaching it to a rat, and then setting it free. He'll know what to do. While you're here, you should also check out TGBS, a cool channel a bit like mine that focuses on PlayStation games from yesteryear and Devil May Cry. Lots of Devil May Cry. Now, that's all well and good, but I wouldn't be here without my wonderful patrons. If you want to support the show, check out the link in the comments, and in return you'll get cool bonus content and infinite absolution for any and all adblock related sins. My top tier Patreon supporters also get a shout out, and those fine friends are Alex Deloch, Asaran, Alno94, Baxter Heel, Brian Natariani, Calvin Han, Colin Haman, Chill, Daniel Metjes, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Evie, Feetsalot, Ibathon, Jesse Ryan, Jonathan Christensen, Joshua Binswanger, Lee Berman, Lucas Slack, Lunar Eagle 1996, Mace Window 54, Manuki, Max Filipov, Patrick Romberg, Philby the Bilby, Phony Homeless, Pim Roggeband, Prospero, Ray's Dad, Sam Myers, Samuel Vanderplatz, Strateger in Ultima, Yaron Mirren, and Chow. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening to all that yet again, and I will see you around. Bye!